one. Welcome to the Lightforge. This is ADWCTA.
This is Merps. Hope you guys are having a good start to the year. Hopefully those resolutions are, actually happening.
You know how I said I was going to work out?
Yeah, you gave up on that already, didn't
I haven't given up on it. I just haven't started yet. There's a huge difference, all right? One means you failed. The other one means you haven't begun to fail yet.
So if you never start, you can never fail.
That's definitely a life lesson that you should know by now. And kids, if you're listening, it's very important.
Wow. If you never try, you will never fail.
Just facts, right? Indisputable
That's
facts.
True. That's very true. Anyways, so for the rest of you, hopefully your year has gotten off to a better start than ADWCTA's. I have been working out, and
don't say like my year hasn't gotten off to a good start. It's been great. I haven't been working out. Haven't you been listening to this? This is like the best start to a year.
Fantastic. There you go. Well, at least he's decent in arena, guys. All right. So what are we talking about this week?
We are talking about, okay, so last week we kind of went like really deep and whatever into the future and the current and the past of the arena. So we're in the MSG meta now. We talked a lot about the MSG meta. I think you guys are probably sick of hearing about the MSG meta. We're not done talking about it yet, but I wanted to at least put in one Lightforge where we kind of go back to like fundamentals of like how to play the arena, right? Like, doesn't matter which meta it is, this is always applicable. And we'll put in some specifics about MSG meta in this as well. But this is like a general how to play arena episode of the Lightforge. And so we're going to start off with Deep Fried Meta, and we're titling this one Opponent Turn Tempo Swing, because I suck at coming up with titles, and that is like the literal description of what we're going to talk about. So let's break that down. All right, let's go word by word, Merps. What is opponent?
That is the person that you face. There are two people involved in an arena game. One is you. The other is called the opponent.
How can you tell which one's the opponent?
Oh, that's a great question, ADWCTA. Well, when you go in, the UI is pretty consistent. You are the person closest to you at the bottom, and your opponent is further away.
Dude, do you play on a computer or like on an iPad or something? How is one closer to you?
It doesn't even matter, because both of them should be the same.
You're tilting your screen in really weird ways then. Okay, so the one on the top is your opponent. Next word, turn. Or connecting it with your opponent. Opponent turn. What does that mean?
Wow. Great question, ADWCTA. 2 back-to-back good questions in a row. That's a record for you.
Starting the new year off right.
Opponent turn is when it is your opponent's turn to act, and they can play cards, and you can't do anything about it because this is Hearthstone and not Magic the Gathering.
That's the most important point I want to make about the word turn, which is that on your opponent's turn, you are always 100% helpless. So we are talking about something that you are totally helpless on. It is what your opponent is doing, and you can't do anything about it. Okay, now what is tempo? And keep this within like 5 paragraphs.
Okay, so we have actually had hour-long Lightforges about tempo,
and we like barely scratched the surface.
Sure, tempo is the ability to turn your mana into
any other resource, not just mana.
Right, to turn into stats on the board. So, what does this include? Tempo includes putting stats onto the board, example, playing a Bloodfen Raptor, right? That's tempo. Taking off stats from the board, still, we're doing stuff on the board. So
how
basically,
do you take stats off the board, Merps?
Well, you could use spells, or you could use like a Bluegill Warrior. You can do lots of stuff, or you can even trade, right? Like trading.
How would trading give you tempo?
Well, here is how. If they have a 4/4 on the board, they have 8 stats. If you have a 4/5 on the board, you have 9 stats, right? So they only have, at this point, you only have +1 stats. But simply by trading into the 4/4, you now have 5 more stats on the board.
Wow.
Right?
That's a lot more stats.
Man.
That's like +4 tempo. And you didn't have to use any resources for that too. That sounds like a pretty good deal.
That's why board initiative is very important. But so those are examples of what tempo are. What is not tempo is if you Earthen Ring Farseer your face, that heal does not contribute to tempo, right? Like healing your face and just doing extra stuff, right? Card draw. And we can get into stuff where it's like, oh, card draw, but with a Daring Reporter, no. Like, purely card draw, that is not tempo. Like healing your face, that is not tempo. We're talking about turning your mana, converting that into a board impact, right? A board impact. That's
so,
tempo.
A lot of times, especially if you come from a Magic the Gathering background and you haven't heard us talk about tempo really deeply because you started listening to the Lightforge in 2016 rather than 2015. We define tempo a little differently than the general word for tempo, because the general word for tempo in normal trading card games is, and probably in Constructed too, is just ending the game quicker. So tempo is both stuff on the board, and it's anything you can do with resources, and most importantly, it's stuff that gets you closer to taking their health down from 30 to 0. Now, that is sometimes a useful concept, but really it's just way too big and messy, and you can't really do anything about it. And, when I'm making algorithms on, how to, value cards or how to, play a turn out, it's not very helpful. So we've broken down tempo into the board. For Hearthstone's purposes, the only thing tempo does is the board. If you're talking about ending the game quicker, or you're talking about face, that's like reach, that's like face damage, that's something different. And together they combine to be something that you may hear, if you're from a Magic the Gathering background or another game, they will call that tempo. We're not going to call that tempo. For us, tempo is just the board. Okay, so what's a tempo swing?
Tempo swing. Well, okay. When it's your opponent's turn, you expect them to do stuff, right? Like they will play cards, they will sort of try to take away the what you've done and add to their board, right? So the tempo swing is sort of, all right, let's say you have a 4/4 on the board, right? By the end of your opponent's turn, and you have let's say like 8 stat units on the board, right? And they have 0, so you have a +8 advantage there. By the end of your opponent's turn, you should not have that advantage. If you do, that probably means they disconnected or just did something really bad, and you're probably going to win.
Arcane Intellect in 2017.
Right, exactly. So the tempo swing is sort of, let's say you have +8 stats on your opponent because you have a 4/4. By the end of their turn, they should be ahead in the stat race or equal, or, you will not have the same lead that you do. And that's sort of what we mean by the tempo swing.
So how much tempo swing does your opponent normally get?
Yeah. So that's sort of the very, explain it to me like I'm 5, and by 5, probably more like 3, because we do it in this very Sesame Street voice.
Dude, how smart are you when you were 3? I would not have gotten any of that until I was 12, man.
You still wouldn't have gotten it. Okay. Okay.
Right.
But now is when we get more complicated and complex. And I think ADWCTA wants to take
complicated and complex. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. We know what tempo is. We know what swing is. What this means is every single turn, it's swinging. It's swinging to the opponent. It's swinging to you. Whichever turn it is, it's like swinging that way, assuming you're using your mana. And like I said, right, it's not just mana. You can use other resources. If you have a weapon, you're also using your life. You can discard cards and get more tempo. You can, I don't know, play a Fell Reaver, and that's just a lot of tempo for resources, which is your deck that you don't even use. Lots of ways to get tempo, and there's a swing that happens. Now, when you're playing, you may be thinking, great, you've just kind of described the game of Hearthstone to me, and I guess that's a useful way to think about things, but what are we talking about here? What is, putting all 4 words together, opponent turn tempo swing? At its basics, it's what your opponent can do, like Merp says, to swing the game back to you. Getting more into the details, let's look at what that actually is numbers-wise. Your starting point of what your opponent can do to swing the turn from an empty board is to use up all of his mana, right? Very standard,
yes.
Assuming he's not using up his other resources, just mana. Almost all cards use up the mana resource. So that means if your opponent has 8 mana, they can put down at the very least an 8/8 on the board. But they also use a card, and each card gives you an extra tempo almost, right? If you're thinking of an 8/8 for 8 mana, that's a pretty bad card. You're probably going to get 8/9 for 8 mana. or like a Boulderfist Ogre, right? 6 mana, 6/7. A Yeti, 4 mana, 4/5. And if you're at like 8 mana, he's probably playing 2 cards. You're going to get 2 of that card bonuses. So instead of looking at 8 mana as getting you 8/8 worth of stats, you're actually going to get something more like 9/9 worth of stats onto the board. Just like realistically speaking. Assuming that he uses up all of his mana, which you should probably assume because that's the most that he can do without doing something crazy. So we're talking about expectations right now. And the expectations, we're going to start with, he's not doing anything crazy. And after I explain the basics, Merps will talk about what it means before it gets crazy, and at which point it gets like so crazy that you probably shouldn't even think about it, but it goes on a scale. The very basics that you should always assume, as long as your opponent is not top decking, is that he can use up all of his mana and he can play 2 cards in a turn. Maybe like just 1 card if it's like turn 4 or something, but after that you just assume 2 cards, which means it's whatever mana he has the next turn. Remember, not this turn, the next turn, because this turn is your turn when you're able to do stuff. It's whatever mana he has plus a 1/1. So it's like if it's 5 mana, it's 6/6. If it's 7 mana, it's 8/8, etc. And that's the very basics. That's like your opponent doesn't do anything. Now your opponent is going to do a little more than just regular stuff. Because if your opponent keeps doing that, you will win. Pretty much always. Like unless you seriously have curve issues, you will just win. Because you have cards that can get way more tempo than your opponents. You just do. Because that's a very baseline. Just to give like a really easy example, a very minimum expectation that your opponent can swing the board whenever you have anything on the board and your opponent has something on the board is by 1 or 2 extra tempo. Because your opponent can easily buff something by 1 or 2, right? A Dark Iron Dwarf, a Shattered Sun Cleric, some extra way to deal 1 more damage more efficiently than your board is. Because remember, you can't do anything during that turn. Only your opponent can. So your stuff is just dead. So your opponent will figure out the right ways to trade it to do all that stuff. So like 1 to 2 tempo in addition to what your opponent can normally do is a good assumption to be making. And on top of that, you can look at your other vulnerabilities. And what do I mean by that? Because if you have any minions on the board, they are all vulnerable. Let's say you have a 3/3 on the board. What can that be removed by? A 2 mana spell that deals 3 damage, right? That's pretty easy. It's pretty easy for your opponent to have a 2 damage spell that deals 3 damage, unless you have a read that he doesn't have like a small removal. And that means he has spent 2 mana to remove your 3 mana's worth of stuff, and he has gained 1 tempo. So, for every minion you have on the board, you should just spot your opponent a tempo, unless you have a read. So if your opponent has 8 mana, you expect him to swing by 9, and then let's say you have 2 minions on the board, you should expect him to be able to swing by 11. You see how the math just adds up? It's like the most basic way to deal with your expectations of what your opponent can do. Now, can your opponent always do that? No. But if you don't have a read that your opponent doesn't have the particular cards that counter whatever you're putting out there, or like the set of cards, not a particular card, right? Like, the general's like deal 4 damage cards, that kind of stuff.
Right.
Then that's the expectation that you should have. And you can just math out every single turn like this.
You can. So back to what ADWCTA was saying, sort of, you can't just go by the vanilla expectations anymore, right? Mm-hmm. It's like back in that was more of a classic or an extremis sort of consideration where you basically say, okay, I'm pretty confident in the tempo swing because the tempo swings before were like Yeti or Boulderfist Ogre, right? Mm-hmm. And those cards just don't do it anymore. And as you can see, it's like reflected in our tier list as well. Like the cards that win you games are no longer Yetis or Boulderfist Ogres. They are really sort of tempo expectation busters, right?
Or so stuff some like kind of expectation busters. Like Call Master's our highest rated card right now. And that's not a tempo expectation buster, but it is like a ridiculous card advantage expectation buster.
Sure. They just play like vanilla cards don't get it done anymore, right? It's going to be stuff like the Krakens, the Shredders, Dark Iron Dwarf. Also, mm-hmm. that's more tempo than you expect, right? Mm-hmm. A lot more than what you expect.
Piloted Shredder, the original tempo buster.
You don't even know how much tempo it gives you.
You don't. But at minimum, it gives you as much tempo as a Yeti.
Yes, at a minimum, which is pretty freaking sick. Mm-hmm. But so the fact is, like, all right, going back to the very beginning, you can't expect to have the same tempo lead, but what you can do is you can say like, okay, well, what am I going to lose? How am I going to lose it? And how much can I expect to lose? So those are the things that we're asking today.
Okay. I'm going to start here from the very, very basics of, because of something I did, my opponent can now do something else that destroys me. That's what all these questions are. Because whenever you set up a board, your opponent is going to act and you can't do anything about it. Once you hit end turn, you don't do anything anymore. So everything, this is going to be hard for some of you to hear, but every large tempo swing, almost every large tempo, there are a few exceptions, but almost every large tempo swing is your fault. Now, when I say your fault, I mean it in the most literal way. Like, if you had not done what you had done, there will not be this tempo swing. Not like you should have done something else. Like, you may not, like, the actions you take may have been correct, but it is still factually something you did that caused the tempo swing. Because if you don't put stuff out, your opponent will find it very, very, very difficult to swing tempo. The opposite of that is that if you don't put anything out, you are not putting tempo on the board. So your opponent doesn't need to swing tempo. Your opponent can just get the tempo. But I just want to set up the way you should think about it. So every time you are putting something onto the board, you need to be cognizant of, like, or even not putting something on the board. If you do a trade or whatever, anything remaining on your board at the end of this is subject to your opponent's whims. And you have two things that you can deal with to determine what your opponent can do. And one is whatever he has on the board right now that you don't clear, that's clearly going to affect your board the next turn. Two, any cards you know he has in his hand, or that you have a good guess, like if you think he has a hard removal, or if you haven't tested for small removals yet, he probably has one, or he's already played a Smuggler's Run and there's still like 2 cards up there that have 1 extra tempo each. Like, you can have a sense of what the tempo swings are. If you have, and this is important information, because let's say you have done that Yeti trade from before, right? And you have that where the Yeti, the 4/5 Yeti that Merps was talking about, eats the 4/4. And you have like, oh my god, 5 tempo instead of +1, and you're all happy. If your opponent is like a mage, you don't really have 5 more tempo. You have 2 more tempo, because your opponent is definitely going to hero power that thing. Yep. So, yes, we say you have 5 more tempo, but if that opponent is a mage, you don't have 5 more tempo. You can only count that as 2 more tempo, because you know 100% what the mage can do. Similarly, if it's not against a mage, but you left your opponent with a 1/1 minion on the board, you don't have +5 tempo. So yes, you have a 5/1, a 4/1, and your opponent has a 1/1. So you may be like, oh, I have 3 more tempo than he does. No, you don't. He's going to run that in, definitely. You have 0 more tempo than your opponent at that point. Even if your opponent doesn't have a guarantee, you should expect a swing. Remember how we were saying that whenever you put a minion on there, you should expect a 1-mana swing against you unless you get a read that your opponent doesn't have that card? Well, if you have a 6/2 on the board, and your opponent has nothing on his board, you may be looking at that and saying that's 8 tempo, but that's 8 very, very easily board flipped tempo, because that 8 tempo can be gotten rid of by one of your opponent's mana, a Holy Smite, right? Or if your opponent isn't one of the classes with that available to them, a 2 mana, like Bluegill Warrior.
Right.
Either way, like, that's not really 8 amounts of tempo. That's 1 or 2 mana, which is 2 or 4 tempo. And so it's not really all that effective when it comes to tempo swing. On the other hand, if your opponent doesn't swing the tempo, that's still really good, right? You get to deal 6 damage to something. So your tempo swing is split into 2 things. One is what you know your opponent will do, which is generally like put out the amount of mana that use up all of your opponent's mana, and then also potentially use hero power and anything on the board. And 2, what you should reasonably expect your opponent to be able to do, which is to be able to use basic removals to gain the tempo that they would have gained, which is at minimum like 1 more on top of each of your minions.
Yeah,
so that's the very basics, right? Cuts across all classes.
Right, and this is why spells or initiative is like, we consider them very good, right? Because being able to take out, like in your example, let's say a 6/2 or like an Ice Rager, right, which is really, really good for its stats. An Ice Rager, or let's say Ethereal Conjurer, right? Mm-hmm. Like 2 mana to be able to take out 9 stats and heavily attack favorite stats is really, really good. So that's why you can't just consider it sort of purely by its stats. At the same time, if you flip it and say you're dealing with an Oasis Snapjaw, yeah, you have a lot of stats, but those are, and it's hard to get rid of, but those sort of, it's sort of, even though they can't do anything to it, you can't really do much to them with your tempo on the board as well. And that's sort of why Hearthstone is a game that sort of favors well-balanced minions, right? Not like 1/8 or 8/1s.
Yep. So again, what's good about your about high attack, low health minions? When you have the board, that's good because you force your opponent to have the removal, which does swing the tempo, but you force them to have that card. What's good about high health, about low attack, high health minions? It's not when you have the board; it's when you don't have the board because it survives, or if you have the board, you have other ways of dealing damage to back it up, and you just want to keep the board. Because otherwise, if you have the board, that card just loses you the board. It may have the right number of stats, but it's just going to lose you the board. Okay, so one more way you play into your opponent's stuff is by having, like, you know, lots of stuff into a board clear or whatever, but that's kind of covered. You can expect to lose 1 tempo for each extra minion you play anyway, right? So the fact that your opponent's using a board clear instead of, like, 2 fireballs is a card advantage issue. It's not really a, what do you call it? Like, it's not really a tempo issue. Okay, so let's get to the final point of this. Why are we talking about all this? So we have just like done a bunch of like math and thinking, and we have these numbers floating around. We know how much tempo we have. We know how much tempo they can swing. We know how much tempo they can expect to swing. What are we doing with this? We have this information now. We've organized it into a way that's presumably usable. So how do we use it?
You use it to win?
Yes.
Is that a good answer?
Yes, that's a great answer. Let's just do that. let's not even talk about this tempo stuff. Let's just play win. That's just all we need to do, right?
Play win?
Yep.
Is that your new thing? Is that like live, laugh, love for 2017? Play win?
That would be nice. So okay, well, let's get to what I mean. So why are we doing this, right? That's kind of the question that you know, I'm asking. I'm sure some of our listeners who are not used to doing this is asking, and it's because this is how you know what cards to play. If you don't know what's going on the board and how to systemize tempo, then how do you know whether you play the 4/5 or the 5/4 onto an empty board, for example? How do you know whether you play that extra raptor or whether you use a hero power to get a 1/1 for your paladin? Most people really just get to that point in decision making and goes, I think I'm going to do this, and then they don't really have a good reason why. It's just something that feels good.
Right. And this is just something that's good in real life, too. If you can somewhat predict what's going to happen in the future, that makes your current decisions better. For example, if you're ADWCTA and you know that your unhealthy lifestyle is going to lead to many complications and become a burden onto the health system, you should probably work out right now.
We will now pause this podcast as I go change.
Back to Hearthstone, guys, in 2017.
Okay, so yeah, the fact that you can do something with this information is huge. It affects all sorts of, not even turn planning, it just affects what you're doing on this turn. Let's say you have, 4 attack on the board, it's going to your opponent's turn 6. Do you play a 4/3 or a 3/4? Well, you have 3 more mana, you have both cards. What do you do? Well, what did I say? I said you had like 4 attack on the board? So you have 4 attack on the board. Your opponent is going to have 6 mana the next turn, which means you could reasonably expect your opponent to put out 7 mana's worth of stuff. If your opponent can use a card to remove your, let's say you have a 4/3, for example. So a 2 mana card would efficiently remove that. So your opponent can put 4 mana's worth of stuff on top of that owl, which is a 4/5. So in that case, would a 3/4 or a 4/3 be better? Well, a 4/3 would be better.
It's going to get eaten up anyway.
It's going to get eaten up if your opponent plays a 4/5. What if they play a 5/4? What if they're like a tiny bit inefficient? Then your 4/3 would matter. On the other hand, what if you have, let's say, a 4/5 on the board and a 2/3 on the board? What do you play, a 3/4 or a 4/5? Or a 4/3? I don't know, maybe you don't play either of them. Maybe you just, like, if you're a paladin, you just hero power, right? Maybe you play a smaller minion. Maybe you play something with a death rattle and don't overextend. Maybe you use that mana and you draw another card. Why? Because you don't need the tempo at that point. So the reason we're looking at what's on the board and what the tempo swings can be is to know these following which condition you're in. Because you're always in one of these conditions if you have the board. And the conditions are: 1, I am in danger of losing the board the next turn. That's like almost always what your condition is. You're almost always in danger of losing the board the next turn, or else the game's not that fun. 2, I'm going to have the board next turn no matter what, or I'm going to get a chance to set up again. So like the most my opponent can do is remove my entire board without developing his own stuff. That's the most that can happen. Or like match me with tempo on the board. And if that's the case, you're technically fine. That's when you want to draw some cards. That's when you want to do some other stuff that's not about the board. Right? That's when you can think about slowing down. And that's also when you have to think, do I really want to overextend on the board? Because there are board clears, and they will just like eat into the board clears. So that's when those decisions come into play. And then there's the other one, which is my opponent's going to have the board no matter what I do. And in those cases, maybe you don't tempo. You have to decide, right, whether you want to tempo at that point in order to try to keep fighting for the board, or if you just want to give it up right now and like try to play for like your big taunt that's going to come out later, or some board clears, or, you know, my opponent's about to run out of cards anyway, I just need to hang on. Like, you can decide then. But if you don't know which state you're in, you can't make a good decision. You're just kind of like randomly going like, well, I want to do this, and it'll work sometimes. There's not that many decisions in Hearthstone, right? You're basically given multiple choice options every turn. But you're not consistently making the right one unless you know what situation you're in. And the only way to know what situation you're in is by doing that tempo math.
Right. So I think some people might be confused and say, how does this relate to something like reads, right? Because it seems like it's very connected. This is the very basis, like the foundation of where reads can come from. Like, reads are sort of more advanced than this. Like, just talking about the opponent turn tempo swing, that is without any reads, right? Like, what are they capable of?
Reads modify this.
Yeah, reads modify it, and also sort of specific cards modify it, right? But we want to just talk about generally, what should you expect? And it's something that surprisingly very few people think about.
Very, very few people.
Once again, it goes back to the basics. And I see a lot of people asking, it's like, oh man, like I average 3 wins, 4 wins, 5 wins. Like, how can I make my reads better? Or like, how can I play around the specific meta better? And if you're averaging like 3, 4, 5, you know, even like 6 wins.
Yeah, anything less than 6.
You're still missing very key fundamentals that are holding you back. So, and I made this analogy.
Just keep in mind, if you're missing this, it doesn't mean you're making all these decisions wrong. Remember, it's a multiple choice. You're still going to get a lot of them right. And you probably are doing it based off of something else that's also better than nothing. Right. So this is just like the best version of this. It's not like you are totally hopeless if you don't use this. Like, you're not going to get every decision wrong without this when it comes up. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah. So by focusing on these small things that you see sort of streamers do, right? Like streamers who are infinite players, like they try to min-max and they try to explain these like fancy plays and sort of like, oh, I made this very specific read based on turn 1, and now I know that card in his hand is a Pyroblast, and I would do this weird play because that is exactly a Pyroblast. Like, it seems cool, but those are, if you don't make that play, but you make all the other simple plays, you're gonna still average 7. Like, you're gonna do that. So focus on stuff like this first, just the basic, boring stuff that ADWCTA makes even more boring with his insurance analogies.
That's totally, like, if you saw risk evaluation, we're just doing risk evaluation, but at like an even more basic level than we were talking about on the risk evaluation thing.
Basically, but recognize ADWCTA's motto: winning is fun. Okay.
Yes.
Fun
is not fun. Winning is fun.
So
if you're having fun and you're losing, you're doing it wrong.
That is exactly ADWCTA's thing. Like, if Hearthstone suddenly in the middle of the game popped up, it's like, answer these 50 quantum physics multiple choice questions, and then you beat your opponent and you get to Happy Feast of Wintervale emote at the end. Actually, be like, oh my god, I'm right on this. I am
Time
so
to
on
learn
top of
quantum
this.
physics.
Yeah. Look, we're about winning, right? Like we want you guys to do better. We want you to win. We want you to have fun while I want you to have fun while winning. ADWCTA just wants you to win and therefore have fun.
There we go. So this is like opponent tempo, right? If you're figuring out what the tempo is, because I just get this question so much. It's like both in coaching or co-ops, or like just Chad would ask, why did you play this card instead of that card? Or we come to a decision where we have like 3 things on the board, and Chad's like, no, don't play the 4th thing. Why are you playing the 4th thing? You're gonna get MCT'd. And I'm like, MCT is gonna happen like 0.02% of the time. I will take that loss. But if I don't play this card, I don't have enough tempo. If my opponent does reasonable things my opponents will do, I lose the board. And I kind of want the board at that point, because I'm not at the point in which I can win if I give up the board. So I had a very, very compelling reason to play the extra 2-drop, whereas it seems like, a good portion of the chat, if not most of it, would be like, no, don't do that. You have so many things on the board. But my things are vulnerable. And playing that 2-drop will shore up the vulnerability. Like, because I'm doing the tempo math, and I've come to the conclusion that actually does help. You also hear it when we co-op with other streamers, because they do the same thing in their heads. Maybe not with the exact numbers, but they're doing the same exact thing with size and whatever. And you'll hear someone say, "Hey, let's do this," and then someone else will be like, "Why?" And they'll be like, "Because it matters." Yeah, because it matters. And then the conversation ends. And if you're watching, you're like, "What just happened?" But because it matters means, based on what my opponents can do the next turn, my opponents could tempo swing against us in a way that we would lose the board if we did not do that. So that's why it matters that you do it.
That phrase is used a lot. I think I watch Hafu stream a lot. I think she used this matters, or that doesn't matter, but this matters. And if you're seeing, you're like, what do you mean matters?
Yeah,
Doesn't
why?
everything matter? But yeah, that's also the language that we use during co-ops as well. It's just because we understand it's by matters, it means okay, this is impactful in a tempo sense.
Yep.
Going into his next turn, what can we expect? This sort of hedges, or this prepares us for the next play.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, and it matters not on this turn, but on my opponent's turn, on what he can do. That's when it matters. So it's just when you're watching and we use that language, or if you're just playing, keep all this stuff in mind. And this is something you should be doing literally every turn. That's why this is so basic. You play around your Potion of Madness only against priests and only sometimes. And yes, you can become a master of reading Potions of Madness and playing around it, sure. But it's not going to get you more wins than if you just get a little bit better at figuring out how to manage your opponent's tempo swings. Before you can decide what your strategy is, you need to know what the situation is. And if you're not factoring in opponent tempo swings to a certain amount of precision, you don't really know what's going on. And so you could be making correct decisions based on what you think is going on, but what you think is going on is not actually going on, right? That's kind of what's a read, right? It's a better understanding of what's going on in the game, and then you can make a decision based on the read. Those are the fancy stuff. This is like Merp said, right? This is before the read. This is so much more basic than the read, but it does the same exact thing at its core. It's just much easier to do. And people infinite players just do it automatically. They know this. They've just seen the patterns enough times that they're doing it in their heads, even if they're not adding every single stat up.
Yeah. So if you're focusing on reads, make sure you have this down first. What at a basic vanilla level, and not even just vanilla level, if you do have a 6-2 on the board, recognize that even though a 6-2 can kill any 5-drop, there's a decent chance you're not actually going to be able to take away a 5-drop off the board because of what they're going to be playing into it, right? They'll play 2-drops instead into it, or they'll just kill it with Yu-Gi-Oh! Warrior or a Dark Bomb or Holy Smite for even better tempo, right? So these are sort of the swings that you want to look out for, just in your head.
Yeah, and if you have a Raptor and a Yeti and you're going to your opponent's turn 7, you don't have the board. Like, you
No.
should know that. That should just be very, very obvious to you that unless your opponent totally does something weird or just happens to not have cards that do stuff at all, you will not have the board. You will lose the board the very next turn. And of course, when you're counting like how to swing the tempo, you should also factor in like what's in your hand when it comes to things with initiative. Because when something has initiative, it's as good as playing it the turn before. If it did not have initiative, it's actually better because your opponent can't act on it first. So if you do have a fireball in your hand, you may not be as afraid, right? So if you have a fireball in your hand, you know that's going to get you a whole bunch of tempo. You may play things with less attack on the board, knowing that you will always have the fireball tempo the next turn, which for 4 mana gets you up to 6 tempo. So there's like, even if there's 5 health that you're removing, you're still gaining a tempo there. So that's something else to consider, and that'll affect what you do. So if you just watch people play and you're like, oh, sometimes they're tempoing, sometimes they seem like they pull back. Why? Usually when they pull back, they have removals in their hands to back it up. Or they're like so hopelessly done with it, you know, that that they're just not going to have the board and they're focusing on other things at that point. Okay. I think that's a pretty good coverage of the opponent turn tempo swing, and it's a very fundamental aspect of gameplay. Like, it's not going to help you draft necessarily, but it's going to make the difference of quite a number of average wins. And more importantly, you feel more in control of the game. You like know exactly when you lose.
Yeah. So a lot of people I see on forums and subreddits, they ask like, man, like how, like I just don't get it, right? Like I average X amount of wins. I don't like. I think I'm making the same exact plays, and a lot of times when I see streamers, I make the same plays as them. So here's the thing. Like ADWCTA says, it's Hearthstone. There aren't that many choices every single turn, right? It's not like other games in which you have a million choices. Like we keep on mentioning Overwatch, but Overwatch has literally like a million choices every single second because of
positioning
and like, you know, aiming and everything, like infinite choices. Here, you can easily luck into the right choice, right? And people by default will remember those more. They'll be like, got this right. And if they do another thing, they'll be like, whatever. It didn't make that big of a difference, right?
It didn't make that big of a difference. It gets washed away a lot. And, you know, we wash away a lot with it didn't make that much big of a difference as well.
Sure.
But we know when it makes a difference. And
it's about the process.
Yeah.
Like, it really is about the process. If you have that process down, if your decision making is streamlined and it's just correct, first, because you can have faulty, you know, like process. If your process is good and if it's streamlined, you are going to make the correct decision consistently almost every single time.
Yeah, you're never going to be perfect.
Right. And this is this is a huge part of it. So work on this, you know, you can work on, and after that, you can work on reads, you can work on your own turns, you know, you can work on this, that, and there are so many things. And, you know, we cover a small section in each Lightforge, but this is a really important piece of it. So I do want to emphasize that, like, you know, if you haven't really worked on this and you're just listening, it's like, what, like, this is basic. Of course I do it. It's like, no, you probably don't.
like less than 5% of arena players do this.
Yeah.
Definitely. Maybe less than 2%.
So start doing it.
Yeah. And, you know, we also like, we try to get focused different, but we like to talk about new stuff. And new stuff is always meta, it's almost always meta-based. And the meta-based stuff is beyond this. It's like way more advanced than all this. This is so basic that it just never gets talked about. But you can be so with the meta, you can know everything that's going on. You can be going face at the right time and, like, you know, playing cards at the right time and drawing cards at the right time, and your win rate will still suffer because you're not setting yourself up where those decisions are game winning as frequently because you like miss a step here or there for the basic like opponent turn tempo swing considerations. Yeah. Anyway, that's a lot of words on this, but it's a very important topic. This is almost like, which cards do I play 101, right? It's one step above like how to trade on the board, but it's more basic than pretty much everything else. Okay, so question from the GOAT. What do we have this week?
Well, you have the question.
I have the question from the GOAT. Do I have a question from the GOAT? I have a question from the GOAT. This is so different. 2017 starting on a really like backwards note.
It has indeed, but it was submitted by one of our viewers.
One
They
of our
exist.
viewers, John. John says the way you choose to play the game is pretty thought intensive, as evidenced by the last 40 minutes. But surely there's times when you don't want to be working that hard to have fun. What do you guys do to have fun or relax when you don't want to think hard?
ADWCTA, why don't you answer this question?
To have fun or relax when I don't. Okay, so honestly, when I don't want to think hard and I just want to relax, what I do the most often, besides drinking, which is only available sometimes because I refuse to drink alone, is to nap. Like, I just go to sleep, like, if I want to relax. Like, if I don't have the energy to, like, go and do stuff and engage with something, I nap. And I nap a lot. And I like napping. And it feels good.
Yeah. So ADWCTA doesn't really. Napping is fun, but he doesn't do anything like. He doesn't like go out and he's like, oh, I'm a part of a book club. Can you imagine ADWCTA as part of a book club? I can't.
People in the book club will hate me.
They would hate you.
Do you know how
so
much I would overanalyze? Like, I don't know, everything.
Yeah, it's like guys, we're moving too fast. Like we didn't go into the metaphysical analysis of the second conjunction in the first sentence, guys. Like
conjunctions are important.
Don't you see what I see?
That's what the author uses to convey and foreshadow.
Oh my god. They just don't get it, man. No. They just want to talk about like relationships and themes.
No, like I read like a trashy romance novel and I'm like, this is like a work of philosophy. And people are like, dude, it's like two people fucking.
I think most people would tend to agree with that analysis, but yes.
So what are you doing? What are you doing in 2017 that when you are not intensively focused on Hearthstone, which I know you've been almost the entire time in 2017 so far, because I missed my stream last week, so it's all been you.
Honestly, man, my life is not that much better than ADWCTA does. I just work out, and I haven't even done my placement matches for Overwatch. I don't do anything. Sad. I haven't really watched Netflix. This is a sad question. I don't like any question that makes me evaluate my life.
I've at least watched Netflix, okay? Instead of working out. It's easier on the body.
You could watch Netflix while you work out.
No, you know I can only do one thing at a time. Like, that's why, like, I'm so low energy generally that, like, I can't do two things at once in any way, shape, or form. Like, for example, if I'm writing or typing something, whether it's like a Reddit post or responding to an email or whatever, I can't also be listening to music. This is also why I don't listen to music when I play Hearthstone. I can listen to music while playing Hearthstone because there's not a lot of thinking going on in Hearthstone for the most part because it's so slow, like on your opponent's turns and things like that. Like, I can think through it in my head, but I can't do that and read chat. Like, listening to music and reading chat and playing Hearthstone can't work for me. So, I'm a very limited person. It's really pretty amazing how far I have come in life and being able to live by myself without, like, I don't know, what do you call those people that help, like, the mentally ill? Not like a butler. Yeah, like an aide.
Okay.
But
right.
It's working so far.
Good for you, man. This is also why ADWCTA was glad that he was born, when he was born, and not like 200 years ago where he had to actually do physical labor and stuff and work. He was definitely not cut out for those times.
All right. Okay, so that's a question from the GOAT from our patrons. If you are a patron and you would like to ask a question, just shoot us a message through Patreon, and we'll pick and choose the good ones, and we'll throw them into the question from the GOAT, because we've been coming up with our own question from the GOATs for like way too long. We're like out of like stuff we want to ask ourselves and we think you'd be interested in. So why don't you tell us what you would be interested in knowing, just like generally about stuff. It could be a silly question. It could be like a real like Hearthstone question too. Just whatever. We'll pick them one a week. And again, patrons is patreon.com/grinandgoat. It's how the Lightforge is funded. All right. Card good bad. You picked this card good bad. Usually I pick the card good bad, but this one was you, and it is Kooky Chemist. So
Kooky freaking Chemist. All right, like it. By the way, it's not Kooky Chemist anymore. It's Kooky freaking Chemist because this card is amazing. I love it. I've been playing a lot with it recently, and it's gone from like good card to an almost like premium card for me.
What is Kooky Chemist, Merps?
Kooky Chemist. All right, for those of you who don't know, you're missing out. All right, Kooky Chemist.
You should get to know this guy, man.
4/4, and it's basically it swaps attack and defense for a minion, right?
Any minion, your opponent's minions, your minions.
Sure. Yep. So it's just a bigger version of Crazed Alchemist, which you don't know is a 2-mana 2/2 that also swaps stats for a minion.
And just so you know, Kooky Chemist is a 56 on the tier list, and so is Crazed Alchemist.
Right. Higher than Yeti, right?
Yep.
Yep. Higher than a Yeti. I think rightfully so. But I just think this card is so insane. For me, it's been performing at like a Dark Iron Dwarf level.
No.
Yeah. Yes.
Really?
Yes. Yeah, because sometimes it doesn't get the Dark Iron Dwarf value, right? Sometimes your board is a little bit awkward, or you just don't, really get the effect. And sometimes it's like a 4-mana 4/4 that deals 3, 4, 5 damage.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's absolutely insane, right? It saved me from a loss so many times because I've done stuff like what was it? I didn't have 1 extra damage. I remember one game specifically, and then the priest, buffed up something into a 9/5, right? Like he basically buffed something up and then hit into something 9/5, and I think I was a non-pink class, and I had like a 4/3, right? And basically I didn't have like 1 extra damage, but I hit into that thing. I turned it into like a 1/9, and then I went on to win the game. So stuff like that would just be impossible, or like you get such an incredible swing out of it. I think it's fantastic. I've been drafting it, and every single time I use it, I'm just like, okay, how does this compare to Dark Iron Dwarf? And I think about like 20% of the time it's worse, like 40% of the time it's the same, and then the rest, like the other 40% of the time, it's just better, like flat out better, like so much better. So this is, and
so you would actually take this over a Dark Iron Dwarf?
No, not yet. No. But no. If it were side to side, like it's hard. I think it's really hard. It's been such an MVP in all of my runs so far.
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing pretty well in MSG, and every single time I use Kooky Chemist, I've thought like, all right, how would it compare with Dark Iron Dwarf, right? And it's just been so freaking good. And it's definitely one of those cards that rewards turn planning, and it rewards you for being a good player as well, right?
Yep.
Because there's some sort of tricky flips in the game, and not only that, like sometimes people are like, oh, this is a good time to use Kooky Chemist on you. No. You guys think like dealing 1 extra damage with Kooky Chemist is good, like let's save it, and then you save it, and later on you deal like 4 extra damage with Kooky Chemist. It's crazy.
All right. So Dark Iron Dwarf, by the way, is a 61. There is only one other common or rare card in the neutrals that's 4 mana between Kooky Chemist and Dark Iron Dwarf, and it's Evil Heckler at 60. So Kooky Chemist is up there, but not quite yet. Merps is trying to talk me into raising it a bit, and it has kind of a bespoke valuation system for the stat flipping, so it's definitely something we might look into.
Yeah.
So okay, so that's where we are right now. All right, Kooky Chemist, the new rising star. Man, all these 4-drops, right? Because you know how there are so many weird 4-drops, right? You have Hosen Healer, Kooky Chemist, Daring Reporter.
Hosen Healer is so good as well.
Yeah, that's also a 56.
Right, but Hosen Healer is like more situational.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Hurting like, your minions is definitely more situational than like essentially like buffing your minion. Or reducing your opponent's minion in a way to buff your minion. So it's even more flexible than buffing your minion.
Yeah. And also, it's like definitely more often you'd prefer 4/4 than a 2/6, right? It's like what we talked about. Like you don't want these like really polarized stat distributions. Yep.
All right. So that is Card Good Bad. And I think that's it for this week. Oh my god, it's under an hour.
We did it.
We did it. All right. Until next week, this is ADWCTA.
This is Merps. Good luck in the arena, guys.
See you guys.